Welcome back to the Alec Lewis Show. I am your host, Alec Lewis. This is episode 141, recording on Saturday, January 17th, where we've got a little emergency podcast episode for you. We don't record a lot on Saturdays, especially in the off-season, a couple weeks after things ended and we've winded down. But with the news of the day, it's kind of a necessity, in my opinion, because it's a big one, in my opinion. If you haven't heard, Vikings offensive line coach Chris Kuper, his contract expired. He will not be retained. That was the team's messaging. The summary, underscored, italicized, underlined, is this. The Vikings are going to have a new offensive line coach. They are searching for that, and we're going to get into all of the dynamics within that topic here on today's emergency podcast episode. If you're new here and watching on YouTube, please hit that subscribe button. It helps us out a ton. You can rate and review, hit the little like, thumbs up if you're listening on Apple or Spotify or iHeart. Follow us there. React to us there. Comments are always welcome. I love interacting. It's why I've done this show and continue to do it for more than a year now. So thank you guys for being here. The show is presented by First Resource Bank. If you're familiar with First Resource, it is a member FDIC bank in the Minneapolis area, run by really good people in Tim Siegley, Aaron Siegley, and Charlie Anderson, who will probably text me about this news, but they've got a great banking platform, and I highly recommend it. The information to set up an account is in the description below. We're also sponsored by Unreal, the locally owned clothing brand. I don't need to say much about it. You can see it's making me looking much better than I typically would look on a Saturday, where I am still recovering for what from what the 2025 season was. All right, bunch of bullet points on this topic regarding Chris Kuper. The first is just a generic thought, take, kind of bit of information that I've said it on the on the podcast in the past, but there years ago, John Gruden, and a lot of people have a lot of thoughts about John Gruden. I happen to think he's incredibly entertaining. I also believe him to be a successful coach, and he's won a Super Bowl. He knows a lot about football. Years ago, he made a comment, believe he was being asked, who's your play caller going to be? Are you going to be doing the play calling, etc.? And he kind of moved past that question to say, essentially, and I'm paraphrasing, but you can ask me about the play caller position and who it's going to be and how that's going to operate. But he said the most important hire that you make as a head coach in the NFL is who your offensive line coach is going to be. He said that, and I think over the years, in my 4 seasons covering the NFL and consuming the NFL and talking to people around the NFL, it often goes under the radar, the importance of who is coaching this position and the magnitude that it can have on everything. On Sunday, obviously, on the dynamics in the locker room, on the ability to draft certain players and develop them so you don't have to spend as much on that position, which helps everywhere else across the team. Like, there are just so many exponential factors that become easier and just affect the team's ability at being the most optimal success that everyone who is in these positions wanted to be, that the offensive line coach touches. I mean, you can look at Indianapolis with Tony Sperano Jr. and what they've done there, where they can allow 2 players to leave the building in Ryan Kelly and Will Fries, and because they've drafted and developed guys like Tanner Bortolini and Matt Gonzalez, they were able to replace them, which allowed them to spend money elsewhere and gave them confidence that they could still do what they wanted to do offensively. It's just a critical component of an NFL staff, and it is a massive role within an NFL organization. So I just want to start there, and why I feel that it's partially why I'm doing an emergency podcast. If you looked around the industry and beat writers whose teams don't retain an offensive line coach, do they do emergency podcasts? I don't really know, but I view it as that important of a position to where I wanted to do this. So I wanted to start there. Second thing, if you don't know about Chris Kuper, Kevin O'Connell hired him in 2022. He had been an assistant offensive line coach with the Denver Broncos, and he had also played with the Denver Broncos. His primary influence and mentor was Mike Munchak, who did it at a really high level, coaching the position for a long time. I believe Mike's also had some consulting crossover with Sean McVay and the Rams, so you have to imagine that there was a little bit of influence there. But Chris Kuper, again, to reiterate, like he had never been a full-time, you're the guy offensive line coach when Kevin O'Connell hired him in 2022. And that's not to say that you can't be successful doing that. There are a lot of offensive line coaches who thrive after years observing how other greats do it. And then the fact that Chris Kuper had been a player gave Kevin O'Connell obviously enough confidence to believe that he could relate to players within that room. And that is so much of what that job is. Before you talk about technique and run schemes and design, etc., you have to talk about, can the person in charge of that room create a family type feel to where those guys are very interconnected, because that is what that position group is. That's why you read anything, you'll hear the offensive line called a weak link system, meaning that it's really difficult for that unit to be good if all five don't rise to a certain level. And it is important for all of those five to be in sync for that unit as a whole to thrive. So that's kind of where Chris Kuper came from. And over the years, Kevin O'Connell maintained confidence and optimism in what Chris Kuper could be as the team's offensive line coach. Like I vividly remember being in Indianapolis last year at the Combine and Kevin O'Connell talking about the fact that they lost assistant offensive line coach Sean Starrett to Jacksonville, who has that job down there for Liam Cohen, and that they were bringing in Keith Carter to be the assistant. But I vividly remember at the time Kevin being clear that he felt like Chris was going to continue to ascend and be one of the premium offensive line coaches in the NFL. And that's obviously still possible. It's just not going to happen here in Minnesota. I'm going to give you some metrics that I pulled for this podcast because I think they're important. And these are all pass blocking metrics, courtesy of Next Gen Stats. But I'm going to go year by year, 2022, 23, 24, and 25. And the two numbers for each year I'm going to give you are where the Vikings' interior offensive line ranked in pressure rate and sacks allowed. So the first number is pressure rate. The second is sacks allowed, 22, 23, 24, 25. In 2022, Chris Kuper's first year, Kevin O'Connell's first year as the head coach of the Vikings team, the interior of the Vikings offensive line ranked 32nd in pressure rate and 31st in sacks allowed. That's not optimal. There's only 32 teams in the NFL if you're new here to the program. As KFAN would say, as KFAN has learned. 2023, 25th in pressure rate, 14th in sacks allowed. So that was an improvement, and that will turn out to be the best season from an interior pass protection under Chris Kuper and Kevin O'Connell. 2024, they were 32nd in pressure rate allowed and 24th in sacks allowed. And then in 2025, again, so in 2025, 32nd in pressure rate allowed and 31st in sacks allowed. So 3 of the 4 seasons under Kevin O'Connell, the interior of the Vikings offensive line has been 32nd in pressure rate allowed in the NFL. I mean, that's putrid just by the facts of the matter. And I say this all the time. All pressures are different. All statistical companies like Next Gen Stats, they measure pressures differently, but there's just no denying the fact that you never want to be 32nd in any statistic, specifically 3 out of the 4 years in this very same statistic. So that's what I'll say. And then twice of the 4 years, they were 31st in sacks allowed on the interior of the offensive line. So, I mean, those are just the numbers. They are objective. They are factual. They always require context of the film, which is why I typically also watch the film, because the numbers just cannot be the end-all, be-all, because they don't tell the full story. But it's just pretty clear cut, and I wanted to provide that. The fourth thing I want to say, so as far as the 2025 numbers in particular, the Vikings had 25 different offensive line combinations this past season. That was like seventh most in the NFL. But they had 17 offensive line combinations that played 10 snaps at least, which was second most in the NFL, behind only the Los Angeles Chargers. So this past year, and you guys know this because we talked about it twice a week, every single week, and I wrote about it at The Athletic constantly when I wasn't writing about quarterback and defense and, play calling and all of that and draft and everything else that is worth talking about with this team right now. We were doing a lot of conversation about the offensive line and the interior. I mean, I go back to what it looked like against Cleveland and London, where you had Joe Huber in there and you had Brandell and Justin School switching from one tackle spot to the other. And that was for so much of the season, with Ryan Kelly's concussions, with Christian Darrisaw, the uncertainty of whether he'd play and how long he would play. I mean, it was a really tough situation for whether it was Chris Kuper or you put the best of all time offensive line coach, it would have been difficult to sustain throughout the season. But complicating the overall evaluation beyond the numbers that I've already passed along is the fact that you look around the league right now, and some of the players who have started on this offensive line in recent years for Chris Kuper and Kevin O'Connell, some of them have performed really well, whether it's Garrett Bradbury in New England, whether it's Dalton Reisner this year in Cleveland, whether it's Ezra Cleveland in Jacksonville. That was a lot of Cleveland back-to-back, heads starting to blend together. That was a lot. Whether it's Ed Ingram in Houston, Vidarian Lowe has given New England some snaps. And then I mentioned Sean Sterrett, who was the assistant who left and went to Jacksonville. I don't think that Jacksonville offensive line was spectacular, but I also don't think they have the talent to ensure that their offensive line performance is going to be spectacular. So that is just another additional factor to why the Vikings would not retain Chris Kuper and why they would move forward in a search for a new offensive line coach. So the next question from you guys listening to this, I'm sure, is like, okay, Alec, so who's going to replace him? I mean, who's available? And it is my job, obviously, to both have conversations, to assess the possibilities, but also to evaluate around the league, okay, who is a sensible candidate who would have some crossover, have some relationship, have the ability, have the command of a room that has a really high expectation. And it's an interesting slate of options when you're talking about which potential offensive line coaches are available. I mean, the most accomplished name that you will hear, and I'm not talking about just for Minnesota, I'm talking about throughout the league, as a lot of these offenses are going to be turned over with new play callers and new staffs. The most obvious name is Bill Callahan, who has been at the pinnacle of coaching offensive line play for decades within the NFL. His son, Brian, was the Tennessee Titans head coach. Brian recently interviewed in Los Angeles for the Chargers offensive coordinator job. So you wonder there, would Bill, who I believe is nearing 70 years old, A, how much does he want to still do it? B, if he does continue to do it, does he want to be able to do it with his son, Brian? And if Brian gets an offensive coordinator job, would that be the obvious spot for him? So that's a dynamic with Bill Callahan. You ask around the industry about like who else exists, and there are four obvious names that surface within my conversations. And I'm not talking about obvious names that have been connected to the Vikings position. So what I would say is, I'm sure this certain aspects of this podcast will get aggregated, may get aggregated. I'm going to make it abundantly clear. Like, I don't have right now a definitive coaching candidate to connect to this Vikings job that is just a no-brainer. This is who the Vikings are after. Where I could say, let's say Brian Flores were to leave, I would say pretty confidently and definitively the internal candidate would be Durante Jones, and the external candidate would be Raheem Morris. I can't with the offensive line spot right now. I can't, and hopefully I get to this point, but it's hard to be really definitive with it. But the four other names, just who are worth eyeing throughout the NFL right now, that came up in my conversations. Frank Smith was Mike McDaniel's offensive coordinator in Miami, and before that he was I believe he was offensive line coach and run game coordinator in Los Angeles with the Chargers. So with Mike McDaniel being let go in Miami, Frank Smith is a name who makes sense. The question obviously would be if Mike McDaniel gets either a head coaching job or an offensive coordinator position throughout the league, and that, I mean, one of those will happen for sure. How much does Frank Smith want to go with him? How tied together are they? I believe they're represented by the same agent, which is a crucial component of it in the coaching industry. But he would be certainly a name, Frank Smith. The others would be Butch Berry was the offensive line coach working with Frank Smith and Mike McDaniel. So let's say Mike McDaniel gets an OC job. Frank Smith can't get an OC job, so he goes to be Mike McDaniel's O-line coach. Then where does that leave Butch Berry? So that would be a name. Pat Meyer in Pittsburgh. So Pittsburgh, a lot of that staff is going to have turnover, obviously with Mike Tomlin not being back. Pat Meyer, I can't speak a ton to the job that he's done in Pittsburgh. I remember watching that Steelers O-line before the Week 4 game in Dublin, and I was mildly okay with it. It didn't blow me away, but that would be a name. And then the other one, which similar to Bill Callahan, Frank Smith, kind of the uncertainty with it would be Dwayne Ledford, who has been the O-line coach in Atlanta and was under Arthur Smith and most recently Zach Robinson. There are a lot of people who rave about him in the industry and the job he's done down there. It's a lot of outside zone, not a crazy amount of change-ups off that, and then he's still under contract down there. So let's say Kevin Stefanski gets the Falcons head coaching position, and he wants to keep Dwayne Ledford. That would obviously take him off the table probably, but he would be a name. So like those five came up when I'm having conversations with people in the industry of like who would make sense as an offensive line coach who's available, and those were five that came up. Bill Callahan, Frank Sinatra, Butch Berry, Pat Meyer, Dwayne Ledford, and then you could look at, as far as other names within this conversation, you look at assistants around the league. One interesting name for me would be Zach Cromer, who's the assistant in Los Angeles with the Rams. He's the son of Aaron Cromer, who is one of the elites doing this in the NFL, currently for Buffalo. Zach Cromer's been in LA for ample time, I believe. Is he ready to take that spot? Would Kevin O'Connell be willing to bet on someone who hasn't held that number one offensive line coaching role with as important of a hire as this obviously is going to be? Like, all of those are questions. You might, if you guys are really astute, you might be asking me the question of, what about Keith Carter, who was brought in as the assistant for this past season, working with Chris Kuper? From what I know, it's my understanding Keith Carter's contract is also up, so would be mildly surprised by that. There's also a lot in the ether about Keith Carter and how he's managed players over the years. So just feels like handing the position to him, given the magnitude that I talked about with this position at the beginning of this podcast, just would be probably, it would be a tough sell, even for me, just as I'm evaluating it. Like in my job, if that was the name, it would be a pretty, I would need a lot probably to buy in that that's the most optimal path with the group that is veteran laden And obviously you have Donovan Jackson, but that's one other aspect of this. Like you have guys in Brian O'Neill and Will Fries and Christian Darrisaw who have seen it done multiple ways. And I mean, I just think about Brian O'Neill in particular. Like you're going to need somebody in there who is easy to get behind for a veteran like that who has the standard that Brian O'Neill has. So that's what I'd say within that conversation. But to round it out, I do think it is a big just factor within this team moving forward. It adds obviously another layer of uncertainty to the pile of it with this offseason when you're talking about quarterback and you're talking about Brian Flores and you're talking about other aspects of the staff and you're talking about the cap situation and you're talking about the leadership entering their fifth season without a playoff win and the ownership having gone 15 seasons, only 2 times getting past the wild card round. I mean, there's a lot of dynamics, and this adds a really big one, in my opinion. So it's unavoidable, and I feel like I probably wouldn't have been doing the job at the level that I want to do it if we did not do this as an emergency podcast today. So, any questions you guys have off this conversation, toss them in the comments section on YouTube. Toss them at me on social media, at Alec_Lewis, at Alec Lewis Show. We'll be back next week with further conversation. But I'm all ears to what you guys think about this and what else is on your mind. I did a mailbag last week at The Athletic with conversation about Jordan Addison, quarterback, and Flores and all of that. So if you missed that, highly recommend going to check that out. With that, enjoy the games this weekend. Stay as warm as you possibly can. And, any other news that is notable and worth keeping an eye on, I will have it on social media. And if there's if we must do another emergency podcast this weekend, we'll get right on that. So, thank you guys for being here. Appreciate you listening to the Alec Lewis Show. Like, subscribe, check out First Resource Bank, check out Unreal, the clothing brand, and we will talk to you very, very soon.